focus because of MDS disease today, so I decided to really just focus on the MDS and what we have done, and this collaboration that mentioned with this group, trying to also show some light into the MDS initiating cells and how we can learn about the clonal evolution from this clinic stage. So, very quick introduction. I think you know probably more than me what is an MDS. I think one of the clear things for me was that MDS is a pre-leukemic disease. Some of the patients will develop into AML, so we thought there was a good potentially disease in order to look more specifically on the clonal evolution in the development. One thing I wanted to also mention is that MDS is as heterogeneous as AML, so there's different subgroups, but they have this clearly common pathophysiology. And one of the things that we have been focusing more specifically, and that's why I mentioned more this spliceosome mutation, is that a lot of patients with MDS have these spliceosome mutated. And one of them, which we have really focused on our attention because of this heterogeneity, we started to decipher the MDS with linked sideroblast or RAS. And the specific subgroup of MDS patients are really clearly specifically mutated for one of these mutations, SF51, which is spliceosome part of the spliceosome complex. And in around 80% of the cases, you will have these mutations. What clearly wasn't known when we started this analysis is we didn't know where SF51 mutations arise, what cells, what is the clonal composition in patients with this MDS disease, and as we are cancer stem cells, that we wanted also to see whether or not we can engraft these MDS patients and look at the evolution in the mice of these different clones present. But the order of mutation of the oncogenic mutation also is not known, so we thought that maybe MDS and specifically this subtype could be a good start for us. So as Dean has started to show you these kind of things, when you are leukemic stem cells or HSC lab, you essentially lab to phenotype and purify cells based on surface marker, and mostly we essentially used similar phenotype HSC, LNP, and NTP, GNP, and saw this population and said where we can find SF51 mutations. And in 4 patients that I'll show you here, we essentially find the mutations already in the more primitive population, HSC, and the mutant allele burden after doing differentiation do not change, indicating that really SF51 early evidence originated from an HSC phenotypic HSC cells. What about overmutation? We know now that both in AML and MDS that the one mutation is not enough to compare an leniency. So we went on to do whole genome sequencing on this population of patient samples. Here I show you 4 examples of it, and we found out that there is indeed different mutations, some more complex. These 2 patients more complex than this one, but there was more than 1 mutations. And if you look at the mutant allele burden and look at the potentially number of clones, you will essentially find out that potentially in these 2 patients there may be 2 major clones, whereas in these 2 patients there may be 1 clone. So we were not convinced by this analysis, so we did colony assay from all of these patients. So we take the CD34 positive, put them in the cellulose, pick up the colonies, and look by targeting sequencing what we find in these colonies originating from single cells. And for certain patients, specifically on these patients, clearly you see that in red, which is the SF1 mutation, you see that a number of colonies have only this mutation, indicating that indeed, in these, at least in these patients, is probably the first mutation rising. And based on these analyses, we can essentially put the sequence of mutation arising in these patients over times. In some other patients, it was more difficult to find out because there's a number of mutations in all the colonies, so we didn't conclude specifically. But clearly, SF1 was also present in all the colonies, indicating that MDS is also very enhanced in the genetics of things. So as we mentioned, we wanted to see whether we can replicate what we have done in AML. So in order to look at whether or not we can find engraftment and what will be the origin of the cells that engraft in propagating the disease in mice. So we went on to purify just CD34 positive from these patients and checked it in the energy, and I will show you later a little bit more information on different potential models that we can use. And look around 12 weeks in this case at the level of engraftment. What I wanted to mention is that we also compare two things here. Normal bone marrow from healthy donors, because most of the data that are generated using normal stem cells are usually from umbilical cord blood, and clearly with umbilical cord blood we can achieve 80 to 90% engraftment into these mice. Clearly when you use adult age match donors, you never got to this level, and I just wanted to mention that because majority of the cases we have at best 10%. So when you look at the MDS RAS populations, even though indeed it's much lower than the normal bone marrow CD34 positive, it's not that different, such a difference. What is much different is the proportion of the multi-lineage engraftment, and as you showed, so let's see here, in a normal condition, in our NHG model, we have a major engraftment of the CD19, the B cell compartment, and a low percentage of myeloid compartment. On the contrary, when you inject MDS or AML, you have a majority exclusively the myeloid populations. So this is just to show you the kinetics of engraftment in 6 weeks, and we push the engraftment to around 18 to 20 weeks, and indeed if you wait a little bit longer for some of the patients, you see that the engraftment increases over the months. We did the same analysis from this mouse, so taking the cells out of the mice and look at what population of cells. So I show you they were myeloid, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they were from the malignant clones. So we did the targeted sequencing of these patients, and here I just show you the SF81 mutations, and they say, well, this is the mutant burden out of the mice. After 18 weeks into the mice, we see similar level of the mutation burden. One population of these cells is able to engraft in the mice, so we did exactly the same as we will do in AML. So different population, as I showed you, HSC, NTP, MLP, CMP, and GMP, and each of these sorted populations into these immunodeficient mice. And for these specific patients, for example, we saw exclusively engraftment in the more primitive HSC compartment. These are the most primitive population that we can sort and that we know in human present. So highly enriched HSC population is responsible for the propagating of these patient samples. What we could also do is look out of the mice. I mentioned that SLAD1 was present. We also, of course, looked at other mutations present into the patient, and they were compared to the mouse after 12 to 18 weeks into the mice. And in some cases, you can see here clearly mutant burden changed quite a bit between these D0 versus the mice, the cells out of the mice. And we were interesting, thanks again for getting good samples from Mufti's group. We were able to get samples from the same patients, but not at diagnosis as it is here, but after 18 months, and this patient was still in MDS phases at that stage. But what was quite, and we injected we did the analysis of this patient at 18 months, and essentially what you can see here, maybe it's just one example and it's one lucky example, but clearly what is going out in our mice is quite similar to what is happening to the patient 2 years or 18 months later during the progression of the disease, indicating potentially that what is more proliferated in our mice may have some sort of clue on how the MDS may progress into the patients. And this same patient actually indeed progressed and evolved into acute myeloid leukemia, and we got samples from that also. So clearly what I also wanted to show you, even though we may not be specialized into phenotype, but clearly as shown by Dean before, this is the MDS stages, which you could almost not see whether we were by phenotype, but normal, Bonnet, or MDS, because this is clearly very similar to a normal phenotype. On the contrary, when you take the patients at AML stages, you see clearly that something is wrong going on. You essentially have almost no HSC anymore, but a very big population of MLP and GMP coming on into these patients. So clearly we also wanted to look at what is happening molecularly into this patient, why it transforms. And one thing that we thought maybe at the origin of the transformation is this deletion 7q. But looking back at the patient at MDS stages, we indeed find that this mutation was still already present in the bone of these MDS, but at a low, so it was a small subclones that were there. So indicating that it is probably these subclones that the transformations occur. When going further into these analyses, we went on to Electron Sequencing these patients at AML in order to detect potentially new mutations that will not be present at MDS stages. And indeed, we find one mutation here that, so in black, this is the, in blue is the MDS diagnosis, in red after 18 months, and in stages is in dark, in black here. You see that these mutations were not present at all in the MDS stages, but arise in stages, and these are sub-mutations not really known in leukemia, but has been shown is a methyltransferase and has been shown in already present in breast cancers. So quite interesting to follow up these mutations, and again, in order to really understand where these mutations arise from the patients which transform in AML, we went on to purify the different populations, HSC, MLP, GMP from these, and look at the sub-mutation. As shown before, in the MDS stages, there was indeed SLB1 and MLP3, for example, but the sub-mutation was not present in HSC in these patients at AML transformations, but the mutation arise mostly in the NLP and was present in the GMP, indicating that if you go now in the history of the mutation in these patients, by following up both the patients during the progression of the disease and via use of the clinical transplantation model, you can essentially identify the logical mutation clonal evolution in these patients. And in these specific cases, we can show essentially that there was a small subclone with these 70 mutations that acquired this mutation, not in the HSC compartment, but during the maturation in the myeloid compartment. And this submutation was potentially enough to transform this patient into kidney. So this is another way to show these. So in MDS phases, the first mutation on this specific patient was SF81. There was other mutation arising from that mostly at the HSC level, but during transformation, it's not the HSC that were transformed, but the myeloid compartment, mostly the NLP and GMP. And we saw by phenotype that these increased a lot, so phenotypically NLP and GMP was highly increased, and they may have a role in abolishing the HSC component, which was highly decreased in these patients. So from this is an example of what we can do using MDS and xenotransplantation model and exon sequencing at the same time. We can essentially indeed further identify the early mutations. In sometimes we really can chronologically find the mutations present in the patients given a diagnosis and go back in time based on the mutant burden and where the mutation was. In some patients it's a bit more difficult, but clearly the analysis allowed us to show the subclonal evolution and clonal evolutions, showing also that in mice, at least contrary to probably what happens in the NL, we see very much a mirror clonal evolution in our mice, and all the mutations were present in all the mice analyzed in this case. In the transformation here, we can essentially show that this was due to an acquisition of a new mutation in the myeloid compartment. Lastly, I think I wanted also to show another thing, because you would probably think that the MDS initiating cell, and this has been also shown on the 5q minus, that MDS propagating cells are essentially the stem cells phenotype, and we find out that is not necessarily the case. This is, of course, one case study, but I think it shows that if it happens in one patient, it could happen in other patients. So it's another patient that we follow up is MDS with neuroproliferative neoplasm. Is a patient with trisomy 8, and most of the cells analyzed. We did again an exon sequencing and we see 34 positive. We find a number of mutations present, and as for the other one, we decided to sort the different population and do exactly the same thing, where the mutations are, what are the mutations in different subpopulation of cells, and this is again the kind of analysis that we did, sort different population and look by target sequencing and exon sequencing and see 34 positive on what the mutation was and where it was. And from this specific patient, what was interesting is that there was indeed a few mutations, but when you sort based on HSC, NDP, NLP, GMP, and CMP, what was interesting is that 2 mutations were not present in the more primitive population, ZCL1 and angioprotein like 5, These were absent in our targeting sequencing. Of course, we cannot completely exclude that they were present at the very minor clones. Our level of detection is probably around 1–2%, so it will have to be lower than that. But clearly, in the overpopulation of more migrant progenitor, they see an expansion of these at around 45% at that stage, so indicating that they expand at that stage. We did the same thing in order to try to characterize what were the first mutation and the history of the mutation and these by doing CD34 positive colony assay and picking up the colony again on these patients. But in these patients, as you can see, it's a bit more complicated. Clearly, in all cells, in all colony, all cells, we can identify H2, so partly to initiate the events in these patients, but we couldn't completely evaluate which are the overmutations chronologically into this patient because they was at the same time. So we went on further again, same kind of analysis in the xenotransplantation model, but this time based on the paper from Anders Strand's group, we decided to change a little bit the way we inject the mice. So we did some mice with injection of only on CD34 positive from these patients. Some mice were injected, NHG mice were injected with co-injected with autologous mesenchymal stroma cells, hoping to find similar upward increase in these mice, but we didn't see any differences whether or not to inject or co-inject autologous MSC. And also we use an NHS, which is for us a new mouse model which separate human IL-3, GM-CSF, and stem cell factor, and we didn't co-inject NSC. And you can see from this you could potentially conclude that indeed NHS, which has these human cytokines, are much better because you've got a much more higher level of environment. But you have to go clearly more in details about that. This is the number of mice and the different mice that we have injected. So indeed, if you look at the red here, the sum up of the injection of 3 mice, you can see that the level of engraftment is much higher than we have seen before using NHG, either alone or with autologous mesenchymal stroma cells. But if you take the patients, the cells out of these mice and look by mutation analysis, what was present out of the 3 mice that were engrafted, 1 was not engrafted actually already. All the NSG injected were engrafted at low level, but still engrafted. So out of the 4 NSGs, we only got 3 engraftment out of the 4, and out of the 3 engrafted samples, only 1 was engrafted with myeloid malignant clone. The rest was normal, residual normal stem cells with mutated engraftment. And I'll show you in more details what that looked like. So this is the 3 mice that were injected and engrafted with these patients. These are the NHS, so the IL-3 stem cell factor, and we did puncture the mice at different time points, so formal puncture, and look at FACS, the evolution of the engraftments from C6, 8, 12 weeks. So you can see from these 2 samples, which you, if you look at here, the black bar represents the human CD45, and if you go into details, the red bar represents the myeloid engraftment, and the 19 represents the myeloid engraftment, and in some cases, here in green, you have the T cells also coming up. But clearly, when you look at these, you have clear good engraftment with CD45 that is kind of multi-lineage, but early on it's really kind of almost only myeloid, which was kind of good sign originally, but these myeloid cells come up, the T cells come up quite early on the contrary, the CD33, which was supposed to come up more for myeloid decreased quite dramatically. The same kind of analysis could be said from these, with on top of that, a decrease in the T cell component of that. And in these two patients who had sacrificed, we essentially didn't detect any of the mutations present in the patient at day 0, and only in these mice we saw a myeloid engraftment with presence of the mutations, despite the presence still of 19 positive normal neurons. So in this is just a summary of what we have done. As I mentioned, all the energy, even though at low, occurring at low level, when we take the cells out of these mice, all the cells were with these mutations, indicating that they are maintaining the malignant clones, whereas only one out of the three that were grafted in this NHES show in the presence of the malignant clone, indicating that when you look at the data, it's not just the level of engraftment, but you really need to do the analysis correctly and look at whether or not it's part of the malignant clone or not. So in this patient, and mostly almost finished on, we did the same kind of analysis, sorting the populations based on HSC, CMP, GMP, MPP, inject a population of cells sorted into either NHG or NHGS, and in this case, both NHG and NHGS, you see that one out of the one mice was in MDS, you don't have so much cells to do a lot of mice, so it's either 1 or 0, but in this case, only the mice injected with NPP gave rise to engraftment. And I show you essentially what it looked like in these two mice, again confirming some of these problems with the NHES, is that you see here the NHES, and we have pushed this engraftment much longer this time, just to see whether or not we can really increase the level of engraftment. And indeed, in these NHE in blue, you see quite clearly that we have increased in the malignant clones of the times, but in NHES we have a very quick increase, but a slow decrease in the malignant clones. And when you sacrifice the mice and look at this population of cells and the presence of the malignant clones, interesting enough, this is the NHG, this is the NHGS. When you look at 32 weeks, there were still human cells into these mice, but when you look at the mutant burden on all of these mutations, none of these mutations were present in NHGS, only in NHG were they present. We took these cells out of these mice, the colony, in order to see whether or not we can indeed copy the clonal diversity present in day 0, and indeed, even though major clones were present as in mutations, we have also linear subclones present in these mice, very similar to the patient at day 0. In order to really verify, because this was the first patient where we got engraftment in the NPP population, we did cellular transplantations out of these mice, and here again we did NHG, so first transplant from NHG or NHGS, because we didn't have these the details of analysis, clonal analysis before, so we also used these NHGS, which were essentially not from a malignant clone we injected in NHGS, but the NHG, we split the cells into NHG or NHGS in secondary, and only the NHG gave rise to engraftment with malignant engraftment, indicating that indeed, at least in these patients, we have proved that the engraftment and the propagating cells is not an HSC-like cells, but an MPP-like. So in conclusion from that, there's different conclusion from that, but I think it's clearly indicating that even in MDS disease, even though it's a pre-leukemic clearance, clearly the first potential mutations, pre-leukemic clearance can occur at the HSC level, but doesn't necessarily mean that the HSC will be the propagating agents in these patients. Here we can show that probably the SXL1 and angiopoietin like 5 mutation that occur only at the MTP level may be responsible for gaining a certain level advantage of the MTP. And so this emphasizes the fact that even in MDS there's a quite heterogeneous disease, and you have to do functional analysis in order to really conclude whether or not the propagating cells in HSC or not. And on the more technical issues, I would say, clearly for us, the energy still represents the more consistent marks because it involves consistently the myelin and core, whereas the energy S, even though for some, and I show you one mouse essentially, where the level of involvement was very high, in a lot of these, we have to be very careful because most of the time we saw essentially involvement of residual normal stem cell increase. I just wanted to conclude to thank people in my lab. This is the new Francis Crick for those that haven't seen the data yet. I just wanted to thank people in my lab in general, most specifically these work were conducted on my lab by Kevin, and on the King's College side, of course, Gulen's group, and more specifically two persons side, which is in the audience, and Alexander, which may or not give you that I haven't seen, so Alexander's group and Gulen's group. Thank you for your attention.